We're delighted today to have Philippe Birker with us from Climate Farmers on regenerative agriculture. Climate Farmers who have recently been nominated, I believe, for an Earthshot Prize. So Philippe will tell us more about that shortly. And then Paul Jepson is joining us for ecosystem restoration, and he needs little introduction. And just in the interest of time, I'll let him do that himself. So I'll hand over to Philippe and Jepson. Philippe and Paul, sorry. Thank you.
Beautiful. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's been very interesting to learn about all these different nature-based solutions, basically, outside of their own context, which I'm operating with regenerative agriculture. So thanks a lot for the invitation. Do you want to kick off this introduction, Paul, or should I?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, great to be here, and really interesting to hear the other stuff. So my name's Paul Jepson. I'm head of innovation at Credit Nature, and I think the way we're going to do this is I'm going to just do a few trends which I'm seeing from my perspective of ecosystem restoration. Philippe will do the same for that'll be about 4 minutes, and then we're just going to try and have a conversation with each other on some things where we see synergies between our areas of ecosystem restoration and regenerative agriculture. So if I could just sort of kick off perhaps with just a few high-level trends. So for me, one of the big trends of the last perhaps 2 or 3 years has been this high-level policy shift from what we call a defensive focus on biodiversity protection to a more proactive agenda of ecosystem recovery. And we're seeing this all over the policy space. And it's not saying that we're putting aside biodiversity protection, it's just now we've got this bigger goal, and there's some quite exciting visions associated with that, like the restoring the temperate rainforest we've just heard of from Ray. I think also, and Kieran just mentioned the word rewilding, that this is coming at the same time, or more, maybe it's interacting with this really progressive approach to ecosystem restoration. It started in the US, but there's really a European pragmatic enterprise or European version of rewilding emerging. And a lot of this is about actually restoring the capacity of ecosystems to restore themselves, the notion of self-willed ecosystems. And I think this speaks to what Anna Maria was talking about earlier when she was talking about people wanting more wilder natures, about people being part of natures, not just the managers or controllers of nature. But it does really give us a science and practice which can help accelerate ecosystem recovery. And then the area I'm working in is, I think this is a really important trend, that with ecosystem recovery or nature recovery, it sort of creates this idea that nature recovery is more investable than biodiversity protection for corporates and institutional investors. And there's a real willingness at the moment for investors or corporates to consider investing into nature recovery on that. And linked to this is a lot of work internationally going on the design of nature markets. So when I say the design of nature markets, we all know of carbon credit markets, and the idea that there could be credit markets, some form of credit markets for biodiversity or ecosystem recovery. But those credit markets, those new markets, need to learn the lessons from carbon, and there's a number of those we can go through. And interestingly, these also, they're not offset markets. They're not markets which are there to help corporates do no harm. They're more, and this is the interest in where corporate investors can be doing good, so they're more sort of what we call nature positive markets. And just speaking to the last session on technology is all over this. So an area we're working a lot on is how do we create these new forms of credits as digital assets built off DLT, and how do we bake in all that verification and the sort of evidence which Ray was talking into this whole system. And these credits are going to be valuable in terms of being able to report nature impacts, in terms of reporting. But we do see a lot, again, talking to something we just heard about the storified value of these credits. So a lot of stuff going on, and very exciting stuff going on there, which may unlock significant flows of money into nature recovery, maybe more on the transition finance, and invest in those ecosystem assets to enable nature-based enterprises to build off them. So Philippe, yeah, over to you for that. Yeah.
Love it. What a perfect introduction. I see a lot of synergies there. I don't know what the general understanding of regenerative agriculture here is, so I will take you on a very quick journey that I went through myself. I would say 5 years in 2 minutes. My journey started in 2017 when basically me and some friends bought an old abandoned village and about 20 hectares of land in rural Portugal, in Serra da Estrela. And then I started looking first into permaculture, which is probably a concept most of you are familiar with. And then through that I got into regenerative agriculture. And regenerative agriculture is essentially, in very simple terms, agriculture which focuses on building up soil health. And to do that, it very much uses natural principles, and it works with nature instead of working against nature, which we're unfortunately doing a lot in the conventional industrial agriculture, which we're all basically nourishing ourselves with, or trying to nourish ourselves with. If you're doing this, you have a lot of positive side effects. You store a lot of carbon in the soil, you increase biodiversity, you also store water in the soil, and you maybe realize already this is tackling some of the biggest issues that we're having, which is loss of biodiversity, climate change, droughts, etc. The interesting thing is this is nothing new. Indigenous people have been doing this thousands of years ago, and also agricultural universities in Europe have been already researching this since the 60s and 70s. There are papers from Wageningen already talking about the fact that we could sequester more carbon in the soil through regenerative agriculture practices than we are emitting on a yearly basis. So we could essentially reverse climate change. However, it's not happening at all. I could not find anything about it in 2017. I could find almost no farmers practicing it. So I went back then on a 1-year journey to visit all of the regenerative farmers that I could find in Western Europe. I visited about 60 farmers. I stayed with them. I worked with them. And I tried to understand 3 things. How did they get into it? Why do they think it's not scaling? And how could I help them? And it was interesting because it was 9 different countries, but the answers were almost always the same. One major issue that we're having is it's not sexy to be a farmer. Young people don't go into farming. And people at the end of their retirement age, 58, which is the average of farmers, are not going to change their ways anymore. The other issues are access to context-specific knowledge to figure out what the transition looked like. And the third issue is essentially transition finance for farmers that want to transition from conventional towards regenerative. So back then, we started advocating for regenerative agriculture. We started storytelling of these farmers. And then one major thing happened, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. There came a documentary out called Kiss the Ground. It came out on Netflix and it went huge. We were working on a documentary as well, but they got Woody Harrelson as a narrator. We could never have gotten that, so we stopped that mission. They did the best job anybody could have done on that topic. And from then on, regenerative agriculture started picking up. This was in 2020. And then suddenly, the whole field started exploding around us. And now we have a situation where all the major food corporates started making claims around regenerative agriculture. Nestle wants to have 25% region ag produce until 2025. Some other companies like Bell Company wants to have 100% in the future. All these claims are out there. Everybody's talking about region ag, but the farmers don't exist, the knowledge doesn't exist, and the transition finance doesn't exist. So we have the situation which we're happening right now of a very hyped up field without the infrastructure in place to actually scale it. And that is what we're trying to work on with climate farmers. But I think to go deeper into that would basically expand the realm of that call now. So I will basically hand it over to Paul so we can jump into the discussion. And if you want to learn more, then feel free to get in touch with me.
Hey, so let's talk about these blockers in the middle. You talked about transition finance and the people, but just first of all, maybe we could just talk about the contrast between ecosystem restoration and regen agriculture, because it always seems that when I talk to professionals, well, sometimes it seems that the regen agriculture community here and the rewilding community is here. And yet every time I talk to people or from regen and rewilding, it seems that actually professionally we're sort of doing the same sort of thing. You talked about working with nature, you know, reconnecting herbivores with the land, all of this sort of thing. And I mean, do you feel that actually we're just on the same journey, but you're coming from a farmer type background or more coming from a nature conservation background? Do you see that, or are we on different journeys?
I would generally say it's 2 sides of the same coin, right? I think both of us want to achieve the same thing. I mean, in regenerative agriculture, you essentially try to replicate natural settings. So one of my favorite ways is, for example, silvopasture, which is essentially herbivores moving on grassland under trees. That's nature. That's essentially what is happening in nature. So I think the transition between rewilding and regenerative agriculture is, for me, a very fluid one. It's essentially, very similar environments which would be having if both are done in the right context. Regenerative agriculture increases biodiversity a lot. If you go on a regenerative farm, you would find a high amount of insect population, you would hear a lot of bird sounds, you would see a lot of smaller animals, So you would have a very, very similar setting and visual and audio experience that you would have in a rewilded area as well.
Yeah, so I mean, this is what here, but one of the things I struggle with, and maybe you have this, it's certainly the case in Britain, it might be more elsewhere, is that there seems to be this historic fight between the farming lobby and the environment lobby. And it's almost like, you know, although we're saying, look, hang on, we're offering something new here, it can bring us together, that there's maybe the media or the unions or the, you know, lobbies or whatever, they just want to keep fighting against us. They just want to see us keep fighting rather than find that common ground.
Yeah.
Do you get it? Because it's a real barrier at the time that you just can't break through to sort of show a better way forward, you know?
I think I couldn't agree more, right? And I mean, I think the regenerative agriculture movement and the rewilding movement, we have the same vision. We want a world where essentially humans are living in harmony with nature. We are a part of nature, and the way how we are existing on this planet should be in a way where nature and humans exist together and exist in harmony with each other. And in the past, this was not the case. A lot of the farmer associations are controlled by chemical companies. Chemical companies definitely don't have an interest in nature playing a big role on the farms. And there's a lot of, I would say, past baggage, which is still there. There's some policy issues there as well. Farmers which are starting with agroforestry systems sometimes run into troubles because of regulations. So there are some issues from the past, but I think the vision for the future and the path towards the future is a very common one, because in the end, we both want the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, I'm sure other people recognize that on the call, but I do think from a comms point of view, we've somehow got to get over this historic fight, which is just not for the future, as you say.
Yeah.
But let's go on to those, I mean, transition finance. So we're seeing this as a big one in terms of, you know, many landowners are interested in maybe moving from, you know, more commerce-based or intensive agriculture into a more regen or nature recovery type enterprise. But to do that, they need to, you know, restructure some of their land assets or sell off some equipment and need that block of transition finance to do it. Are you finding any solutions to that? Because again, this is a tricky one for, you know, it's great to have the vision, but there's the practical realities of how do you finance it?
I mean, this is exactly the point where we're working on climate farmers. So on the one hand, we're providing a community for farmers to peer-to-peer exchange. We're providing them with context-specific knowledge, and then we generate something which we call ecosystem credits. So we're using remote sensing technology in order to basically assess what's happening on the farms and to measure the increase in biodiversity, the increase in carbon in the soil, and the increase in soil water storage capacity. And for these things, we basically package it and we try to get the farmers paid for these ecosystem services, which they're essentially providing for all of us. I would love to have society pay for this. Unfortunately, governments are very slow in adjusting these things, and there's not a lot of money flowing yet in this direction. I would love to see European subsidies being paid out based on regeneration that's happening on farms. But at the moment, the main drivers here that I see is corporates, which are willing to essentially compensate for CO2 emissions, and carbon is the main thing that I can get farmers paid for right now. I would love for this to be different, and I would love to have biodiversity payments by society, but unfortunately, this is not the point where we're at the moment, and the payment that we can get to the farmers is not enough yet to give them the transition finance that they need. So we can cover part of the transition costs, but not all of the transition costs. And this is one of the biggest blockers that we're seeing right now to farmers that want to adopt, that want to go in this path, that are really excited to go in this path, but they can't because of financial restraints, because all that they get paid for is the yield that they're producing, but not the ecosystem services which they would be providing. And that's a core issue, I think, in our society right now.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually the issue we're trying to solve. And I must say, it's beginning to get closer. You know, we've got this idea of a nature impact token where companies or investors are investing in the underlying ecosystem assets, and then you can pay carbon off it. And it's interesting, just before this call, I was on a meeting which there was a company showing some, sorry, just to close this door, showing some research that 35% of FTSE 350 companies are very interested in doing these things. It's just the mechanisms aren't quite there. So maybe we'll get to that. Just on that though, so maybe this isn't a problem for you, but it's so much from the farming community. But another big blocker we've got is people who are wanting to move more out of farming to nature-based enterprises, be some of the eco-health enterprises we were talking about, or the experiential enterprises, that there isn't a tax framework to help them, because as soon as agriculture doesn't become the main revenue stream, then they're not what do you call it? They're not eligible for agricultural tax relief, and there isn't yet a nature recovery or nature-based tax relief. Maybe that's not in your, but it's a big issue in our world. This at the moment, that they're just not sure what the tax regime is.
Yeah, I mean, the related issue to us would exactly be this issue of exclusively being paid for yield. So it doesn't matter what the nutrients in the food of farmers are. It doesn't matter what the positive side effects of the farming are. The only pay that they get is for the yield that they're having. And this, I think, is the issue that we need to change, because essentially, just because you produce a lot of something doesn't mean it's actually nutrient and healthy food. And essentially, the twisted part about this is still that the companies which are selling us the chemical fertilizers to increase yield but decrease soil health and decrease nutrition also sell us the medicine afterwards, right? So we are in this twisted role that a few companies are essentially, well, gaining financially from not us farming in line with nature, but us farming in line with chemical profits.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? So you've got the more commercial driver problem, and we've got the more tax regime problem.
Exactly.
Okay. Hey, I'm not quite sure how many minutes we've got left, but let's just go on to that interesting point you made about human resources. I think it was about the capacity and people coming into farming. What maybe let's just follow on that. So what's your experience there?
I mean, this is a very interesting issue that I didn't think about before, but that is I think very obvious in our society. Like we stopped cherishing farmers. Like I grew up in an agricultural context. I grew up in a village with 500 people. In my high school, no one said, when I want to grow old, I want to become a farmer. However, we all cannot survive without farmers. We could all do a little less without life coaches. We all could do a little less without consultants, but we can't live without farmers. And the fact that farmers are not well regarded in society, and that it's not something you would mention on your first Tinder date to be a farmer, is the outcome of that is that farmers are now around 58 years old in the European Union on average. And this is an issue. When they retire, there's no next generation. And unless we start making it more attractive to farmers by giving them societal recognition, by giving them the financial money that they should be receiving, we will run into major issues in the European Union with the farmers' crisis that we're having.
Guys, thank you very much. I'm just going to have to jump in very quickly.
Great.
I'm really sorry. We would love to keep this conversation going. Who'd have thought a farmer and an environmentalist would talk to each other for so long? But
we do it all the time, really, you know.
I'd say if we asked for a show of hands, everybody here would jump at the chance to hear you speak longer. So hopefully we can arrange something in the future.
Cool. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thanks very much, everybody.
It was a big pleasure.
Guys, apologies to cut it short, but we'll bring in the next speakers. Thank you very much.